I think this is the type of stuff where I could picture someone listening. There's some people that just aren't going to be believers, and that's totally fine. But when you hear this, it's got to make you think, not coming from me because I'm biased, right? But coming from like a Fancy and Steve that we're unbiased coming into it and we're thinking about it, it makes you think like maybe I should be doing something. And maybe it's just asking Fancy and Steve, I have a story to share. I'd like to come on your podcast. And sometimes maybe you don't have to take on the whole thing of creating your own. That's another obstacle for a lot of people. Like building something from scratch is like, this is a blank piece of paper. What do you want me to do with it? Like that's a lot for someone to think through.
Every person has a story that matters. And it doesn't matter to me if that person is diverse or is not, or thinks of themselves as diverse or doesn't. Like, that's not the point. Every person has a story. And it's more important that your story gets told, I think, than it is for you to sit there and go, I don't want to be a part of a podcast because I don't know what to do. Mm-hmm. Your story should be told. Your words have value no matter what your confidence level is. You got to get over your confidence level and let somebody like you, Eric, coach them through that, which you did with us, because their words, their thoughts, and their mind has value to people. If it didn't, they wouldn't have friends, they wouldn't have family, they wouldn't have clients, they wouldn't have respected colleagues. Like, their words really matter. So I think if someone was on the fence thinking, should I do this or should I not? I would say emphatically they should, because their story really does count.
This is Entrepreneur Perspectives, introspective podcast conversations with and for entrepreneurs. This podcast is produced by the team at CastSource. If you are looking to start a podcast, appear on podcasts, or create original content, go to castsource.com, or you can DM me on Twitter at Eric_Kaz. In this conversation, I'm joined by the hosts of Real Talk, Fancy Worthington and Steve Oliver. Fancy and Steve are leaders and advisors at Cetera Financial. Their podcast, Real Talk, is anything but just another diversity podcast. They bring so much energy, experience, humility, compassion, and fun, all with essential yet uncomfortable dialogue that is not easy to pull off. But they do it, and that's what makes Real Talk such a special podcast, a necessary podcast. We work with Fancy and Steve because we believe in their message, and to have this conversation that's all about why they started their podcast means so much to me. Fancy and Steve share their truths about all of this and much more. When it comes to diversity, we all have so much to learn. And besides reading, talking to others that are willing to be real with you is one of the best ways we can learn. Thank you to Fancy and Steve for giving us this opportunity to be a part of their all-important and amazing Real Talk platform. You should for sure check the Real Talk podcast out on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Search Real Talk with Fancy and Steve. Let's get into this conversation with Fancy and Steve. We want to quickly highlight a company that you may not know about but should. For this episode, that is Millennium Counseling Center in Chicago, Illinois. Their mission is to help people find a way out of the shame and pain often caused by addiction, mental illness, and trauma. Millennium Counseling Center believes that with hard work and dedication, people can reclaim the hope that has been stripped away. When you spend even a moment talking with anyone on the team at Millennium, you see how important you are to them. Learn more about Millennium at millenniumhope.com. Also, if you're in and around the world of sports, they have a fast-growing sports and performance wellness division. And be sure to subscribe to their Millennium Counseling Center podcast on your favorite podcast app. We work with the team at Millennium, and that's because we believe in them and know the work they do has real impact. MillenniumHope.com. Real quick before we get started, CasCM is our content production company. Why content? It's simple. Content brings people together. I've seen it play out over and over, and I want to help others explore and discover this for themselves. The experience is totally worth it. Learn more at CasCM.com. We focus on podcasts and writing, one piece of content at a time. It all starts with conversations, just like this one. There's these uncomfortable moments that we all have in life. And I think there's some trauma to those moments to where something took place and it starts shaping us as to who we are and what we want to achieve and what we want to do. Steve, I think you played sports growing up. I think you were a football player.
Yep.
And you dealt with racism on the field, like right there. And I think you have a story about that. And if you don't mind, I would like for you to share that story and take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, sports, I dealt with all types of racism, but the earliest memory was playing baseball. So in baseball, as a 5 or 6 year old, there were two leagues. There was what was called the farm league, and then there was the majors. Now, as a 6 year old or 7 year old, doesn't seem like a big deal, but it is a big deal. The major league gets uniforms. The farm league only gets a t-shirt and you play in your jeans. Now, most people say, what's the difference? It's a big difference when you're a kid. You know, the color of your uniform, your number, all these things, because we're trying to be as professional and look like the things that we see on TV. So my tryout was 4 pitches. Out of 4 pitches, I hit 3 over the fence and 1 to the warning track. No one else did that. And then a little bit of feeling, I didn't miss a ball. The next day, you had to wait from 9 o'clock till 12 o'clock. They called you to see if you made the team. I waited. As you can imagine, the phone was on the wall back then. And I waited and waited and waited. And every time the phone rang, which it only rang once or twice, it was a Sunday, I was sitting there just waiting, watching the clock. I never got the call. And no one could understand what happened to me as to why I didn't make it. That's when my father had to explain, here's the deal with racism. And when we saw the kids that actually did make the team, it was all baked in, the coach's kids, and it was traumatic to me. So at that point, I wanted to fold with baseball, but I went into the farm league and just hit home runs and all this other stuff and did really well. But I made sure the following year, I didn't want to quit. I wanted to make sure I got on the Barons. Yeah, it was the Barons, red and gray, to get that uniform. But at that point, I still think about that anytime I smell that I'm about to get screwed over and I see things aren't fair.
Yeah.
So that was really my earliest. That was one. And then my other one quickly would be when I was training for football in Texas as a high schooler, but I was playing in New Jersey, but I would go running. Someone threw a watermelon at me. And I was kind of telling my parents, because I love jokes. And I said, hey, I got a watermelon thrown at me. And they're like, you don't even know why. Because I don't like watermelons. I'm too lazy to pull the seeds out. I can't stand it, actually. And he explained as to why. That's why you got the watermelon thrown at you. You heard him barking. So those are 2 things that I always think about when I'm on this journey, and also what got me through sports. I'm actually grateful for all those lessons, to be honest with you. I wouldn't change one single thing about it.
Yeah. And now here you are sharing these stories. I mean, for someone like me to hear that, that's why I want to prioritize these types of conversations. So every time I'm here, and I'm not usually speaking when you're recording the Real Talk, but I'm there, right? It has so much impact when I hear it. So I know if, okay, I'm impacted by it. This can impact so many people. And this is why these conversations are so important. That's why podcasts, or just sharing some side of your story. Maybe you don't share that story the first time around. Maybe it's like going to therapy. Like a lot of times it's session 62 where something comes out about your childhood, about that story that you told about playing football in Texas. And it just takes time to get to that. But the way you just even share it, like we're all listening and just, I don't even know what the words are. I'd have to sit with that for a long time to even like comprehend, like, well, I couldn't understand what I couldn't put myself in those shoes. But I think it's important for us to understand what other people are going through. And Fancy, I've sat in many meetings and board meetings with you and had many calls with you. And I've always been fascinated because when you open up and you start talking, you're one of the few people that I really want to hear your opinions. I want to hear your thoughts on it. And you're very outgoing, you're outspoken, the great demeanor about it all. But, I've talked to many women in business, and it's been complicated because sometimes you'll find yourself as the only woman in the room. And I've heard that story. I don't know what that's like, right? I have 2 daughters, and I'm intrigued. I'm fascinated by all of it because I want my daughters to hear what it is like when you're the only woman in the room. And I'm sure you have many stories just like Steve does. So, take that in any direction you want.
Yeah, I grew up with a very strong mother, business owner, and my parents owned a financial planning practice, and I grew up working in that practice. And so I never saw the only person in the room until I got into business on my own. And then it happened all the time, and it would become very uncomfortable often because at first I didn't know where to sit in the room. And Steve and I have talked about that before of like, where should you sit if you are a diverse candidate, that's the only, whatever your only is in the room. And what do you do? You're at that meeting, and how do you position yourself in that meeting? So we've had a lot of conversations about that. But the worst, I think, was in the casual timeframes. It wasn't always just being the only woman at the board table. It wasn't always being the only woman in a committee or something like that. And those have their moments because you have to stretch your confidence and you have to say, I'm willing to go ahead and speak up, even if it's wrong. And I'm willing to do something just to make a total fool of myself if I have to, but I'm going to speak up. But I think that the worst onlys are in the casual settings. So if you're the only woman and everybody's hanging out late at night at the bar and you're at a business conference, do you stick around or do you remove yourself? What happens when the jokes get told or whatever? And most of the direct stories that I could tell are so crass, I would never want them to be heard. I just don't even want to talk about it anymore. So I think about the redeeming moments of those, just like Steve does, in what did I get from it and how did it make me so much better? And where did I learn to put my boundaries up? And I think if there was anything I would say to your daughters is learn what your boundaries are earlier than I did, just because I would have had so much more confidence to leave a little bit earlier, you'll probably never see me late at night at a business conference.
Yeah, you've said that before. Yeah.
You typically don't see me there. I do the exit, where no one knows where I've gone and they look around and they go, oh, where's Fancy? And then they just keep talking.
Yeah. You knew your boundary.
Yeah. The boundaries are just, very important. And you don't know them at the beginning. You feel like you're supposed to be there because it's going to affect your career or something.
Yeah. Well, you hear about it a lot with sports teams, right? Because there's someone there that controls your playing time. And if you're on the team, and that's why these stories are coming from. There was a coach in North Carolina, right? And there's so much power that coach had that the women on the team were afraid to not do what he wanted them to do because that was their career. They had trained their entire life to get to that situation. There's a word that comes to mind when I hear all these stories is uncomfortable. And when the idea of this podcast of Real Talk started coming out, you hear it. It's like, okay, it's a diversity podcast. Okay. Diversity is a word that's thrown around a lot. And we've talked about this. It's like, oh, another more diversity content. Like, is this going to be corporate speak? Is this going to be like what we always hear? And I'm not like, here's the 5-star review about it. It's anything but that. It's not just uncomfortable conversations like, oh my God, I can't believe this is very hard to hear. But it's real conversations and it's real talk. And I think that's where this comes from. And so when I hear these stories, is that, Fancy or Steve, is that one of the reasons why, and I think you did allude to this, why this podcast even exists in the first place? Like, I don't get the sense that this is about acquiring new clients, right? You always hear like, well, if you're going to have a podcast, we have to have a return on this investment of our time and money and energy to then how much money do we make off of it? This is way bigger than that. And I think it's going to have far better reach than anything else that you did. But is that one of the main reasons why Real Talk even exists today?
It exists for a couple of reasons. You've hit them all. Yes, it is about acquiring new clients because you don't know your next client is going to be a diverse candidate. You don't know if your next client is someone brown. You don't know if your next client has a spouse, a traditional spouse, as they would say, a mate. You don't know what your next client may be 18 years old because his parents have passed away. So we're preparing people to have conversations with the next client because the client today will not look the same in the future. I promise you that. And our profession is changing because those people that are in control right now will not be in control later on just because of simple demographics. Even if you look at gender diversity, the purpose of this podcast really is if this can provide some education and awareness for someone that can take 10 minutes out of their day, whether they're in the gym or walking or in their car, then we've succeeded. And that's really what we're trying to do is leave some content available where we're comfortable to tell a little bit of our stories through a learned and a lived experience. I did want to back up on one thing. Fancy brought up a good point. I've heard that a million times. As a female, they should go to their rooms quickly. Right after meetings, don't hang out late. I actually do not. I'm always the last to leave for one reason, because I feel like, why should I have to leave? Because I was told it's always downside. The only difference is here for me, I may be the last one to leave, but I'm always the first one into the next meeting because I'm never going to allow them to say he was hanging out late and he didn't show up and he's not ready to go. And that's just a combination of drinking a lot of water,
Yeah.
So it's interesting what you have to do. And if you think about it, what Fancy's story is, there's a whole game plan that she's working on, whereas many others just show up and they do what they want and they hang out as long as they'd like to. And they don't even think about it. But look what she has to think about. And look what I have to think about when you are either the only one or one of very few.
Yeah.
And, I've never missed an opportunity because I wasn't at the bar at 2 a.m. or whatever. There's nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that for women. Nothing. It was just my boundary. And I think whatever your boundary is and what your boundary isn't is up to you as an individual. And it just gives you those bumper pads to say, like, if I know, a perfect example is I had a friend that said he never wanted to go networking, building his practice. He didn't want to go networking ever. And so I was like, okay, well, if that's the case, then you have to really focus on referrals the most. So that's all it did for me, is putting that particular boundary around myself, is that I knew I had to work in a different manner in order to still achieve things with my career and with my life. And it does not mean that I missed opportunities. It's that I recreated the same opportunities, but within my boundaries. And I took control of those to do that. And Eric, you were asking about the why on the podcast. One of my favorite things about Steve is that we talk very candidly with each other, but he's not the only person who is a Black male that I've had very candid conversations with. And one of them was one of my team members when I was a sales manager with another firm that I loved very much. And he was so gracious to me on so many occasions of just being able to say, here's where you're messing up. And I mean, he needed my help on building a practice, but I needed his help on what to say and what not to say, and what to handle and what not to handle. And I remember one time I hired a Black female, and her first day, her hair was a completely different color than the day that I interviewed her. And I would have been like, whoa, what is that? And I was like, James, what do I do? And he immediately said to me, he's like, you can't do anything. You just can't do anything. That's not important. Does that mean she's going to be successful as an advisor or not? It's not up to you. It's not your culture. It's not your people that she's going to be talking to. Your job is to help her grow her practice around her parameters. And it's the exact same scenario. And she ended up doing very well with us. And I was so grateful to have someone that I could talk to. And I would say that everyone needs an advocate like that will help them go through tricky waters that you may not understand. And to me, that's why we do this podcast, is we want to help people go through tricky waters and do it in a way where they're vulnerable. If more people could be vulnerable, it would just make it so much easier for diversity to move in a positive manner and it not be something that people have to do.
It's all so honest. I'm not trying to like, hey, what's the word that comes to mind when you all talk? But that just happened the last few times, is this honesty. But it's honest with yourself, and it's honest with your stories. And then you use the word vulnerable. I even wrote it down because that's what this is, right? There's so much honesty and vulnerability to that, to the people around you, to even share that you're having that thought, because you could easily have kept that one in, because what's he going to think if I ask that question, right? There's a lot in that. And then it's just talking it through. It's like we're all sitting on the couch right now and we're all just talking through this stuff. And I think that's where your podcast has gone. And to your point, Steve, like, it can be heard by so many people. Like, think about recruiting. Like, you want to go hire more people? Well, guess what? Go listen to Steve talk. If you don't like the way Steve, his honesty and the way he tells his stories, then don't go work for Steve, right? But that's going to save everybody a bunch of time. On the flip side, now you really get to see what you all are about. And this isn't just like, we've talked about this. You could say we have a world-class customer service. What does that even mean? Okay, great. So let me call the airlines and see if I can get my ticket changed. And I'm sitting on the line for 45 minutes and the person I talk to doesn't want to help me out. And it's very clear, and they hang up on me. What kind of world-class customer service is that? Just because you say you have it doesn't mean you do. Just because you say we value diversity doesn't mean you do. You can't just put those things on the wall. You have to talk about it, right? And that's what you're all doing.
Yeah, the intentionality about it is important. There's so many aspects that we have to correct over time. The one thing I've told people in a private lecture, I like it when we have conversations, and to Fancy's point about the lady's hair, there's a history behind that, especially with Black people, where our hair had to be a certain way because it wasn't professional. And we've been told it wasn't professional. Just like me as a 6'3", 285-pound ex-football player, I had to stand a certain way so I'm not intimidating. When you hear that over and over again, it's just exhausting. But what I like about it is we have to have it where I always think back of, I love childhood games, Operator. You know, I used to have that little crappy game. But when you made a mistake, it would just, we don't want it like where someone's made a mistake. And I believe Fancy's intention to comment on her hair was like, hey, your hair is different, you know, because it's just a way of conversation. Just like when people ask you where you're from, because we're all binding and looking for commonality. We're looking for ways to talk about something to get over the day to day. Fancy's not going to say, hey, how much money do you have in the bank? And tell me about something personal. You're just trying to warm up to those questions. And people are generally curious at where you're from because they're looking for that common bond.
Yeah.
And it also could have been this time where I could have made a devastating mistake.
Right.
Not intentionally, but I could have made a huge mistake. And I would have offended her. I would have perpetuated this theory that I'm the white person trying to, tell her how to wear her hair or whatever. And because I had that person that was sitting there that was willing to be candid, and I was also willing to be vulnerable, which is the two-way street in this, is that he saved me from making some type of mistake that I wouldn't have known about, but I also would have felt terribly about fast forwarding to today if we'd been sitting here and I behaved differently, knowing now what I didn't know then.
Yeah.
And that, I wouldn't say you were going to make a mistake. I would say you would make another mistake because we make mistakes all the time. All of us make mistakes all the time. And like to your point, isn't it nice to know in advance? Would you like to find out that we had a Zoom meeting and someone can see the piece of broccoli in my teeth the whole time and no one told me till after it was recorded? No. Or a stain on my shirt from the gallons of wine that I'm going to have later on. And, I'm a male that lives by himself and doesn't wash his clothes. So, I'm wearing it for a week. Those are the things that seriously, you're better off knowing today and being course corrected and learning from.
Yeah. Well, that goes back to what we were talking about before we started recording today, Fancy, is thinking back to when you recorded your first episode. And we use the word cringeworthy, like, oh my God, what did I... It's this process that we're going down. So like when you go on this path of this podcast and you have a mic and now you're being recorded and then you're going to share it with your colleagues, and anyone that wants to listen they can go to Spotify and they can go listen to you now, whether it's good or bad, and they're going to have their opinions and people are going to question it, whether they say it out loud or don't say it out loud. They're going to have that. Steve, you're talking about mistakes. Like, how many mistakes have you all made on the podcast already, right? I mean, there was a time I remember when you had said something, Steve, and Fancy afterwards said, I don't think you can say that. We need to go back and we need to talk about that. And you learned something in that moment. And then you're like, okay. And I thought that was so cool because it's like, you weren't offended by that you got it wrong. And you weren't mad that Fancy called you out. You're like, thank you for that. And then we got it fixed. But going back on I remember when I started making podcasts, I go listen to some of them, or when you start writing, what was I talking about? Right. But how are you going to learn? My daughter was going to play tennis for the first time and she's like, but I don't know how to play tennis. And she's like, real little. Of course you don't know how to play tennis. You've never played tennis before. Someone's got to start somewhere. And then you show up and you get a little better and maybe you don't like it and you go do something else. But how else are we going to learn until we go out and actually try it? So, speaking on just starting a podcast and what that felt like.
And fail. You have to fail in order to learn a little bit. The other part about the podcast I would tell you is, which is very important to me, is having something that's out there that people can hear our words. And I feel like erasure, because people throw away things and trophies and writings, and erasure it's almost like a form of violence to me. You can erase someone and no one ever knew what was actually interpreted or said. When you have a podcast, you hear those words and now you know. I can always say, if people have taken the time to listen to the great Dr. Martin Luther King, it is amazing. If he didn't have recordings or writings, I guarantee his words would be interpreted much differently. If you look at all these people, if you look at singers, Fancy's favorite singer, Dolly Parton, can you imagine if no one was able to record her lyrics and really understand her story? Because I guarantee she was misinterpreted. That's one thing that's important about the podcast, because whether you're discussing financial reasons as to what your message is going to be, or diversity, weight loss, it doesn't matter. At least people have the ability to hear your voice and your opinion on it. It may not be right or wrong, but it's just an opinion that someone can reflect back on.
Yeah, and it's hard. I sit there and every time you say something, I'm like, oh yeah, I can think of an exact example of this, and I can think of an exact example of that. But I will tell you that that first episode that we did, when I listened to it, it is the worst thing ever. And it is truly like I think now, like I listen to some of the podcasts that we've done and I'm like, oh, this was a really good one. And oh, I really like this one, or oh, I wish I had said this story instead of that story. But I listened to the first episode that we did, and I mean, I'm not sure, but I think I was sick. I don't know, but it was awful. It was so embarrassing. And I think about people that make music like Dolly Parton. I mean, when she goes into the studio, and when I have several friends in music business and family, but when they go into the studio, like you don't have communications with them for a week. You don't see them, you don't talk to them, you don't get your feelings hurt over it, but they understand the gravity that once you put that album together, once you record that song, it is always there. It's permanent and it cannot be changed after the fact. You can go back and remaster something and release a new episode, but that does not mean that the first one didn't exist. And there's so much weight on artists and musicians when they're doing that. And that kept running through my head when I went back 6 months later and listened to that very first episode and how awful I thought it was. I didn't think it was awful at the beginning. So I go back and listen to it and I'm just like, oh my God, it's the worst thing ever. Like, I don't even want to think about it. Like right now, my face is getting red.
You mentioned Dolly Parton. So I think of another country music singer, Dustin Lynch. I heard him in an interview and they said, how quickly do you write a hit? He says, it takes me 100 songs to write one hit. So he's got to go through, and he says, like basically 100 terrible versions of whatever the thing is to get to that one song that has a chance of being a hit. Think about that. That's a lot of like studio time and thinking time, and who knows what he's got to go through to get to that point. And it might never even happen. 100 songs is a lot of songs. Go ask an artist, they'll be like, wow, that's a lot to get to that point. And, you know, there's going to be terrible ones. There's going to be mistakes. Like you hear comedians, famous comedians, and they go and practice. They go to comedy clubs in New York City or wherever they can go, and they get stage time and they'll bomb. And they talk about Chris Rock. Chris Rock is bringing up his notes and he's trying stuff and he's making notes while he's up there and he's just making mistakes. So people have been there like, it was terrible, because he's getting ready for the big Netflix special or whatever that is, because he's setting himself up. And it's like, you have to just keep showing up to just have that opportunity. So that terrible episode, kind of like what you were saying before, Steve, you wouldn't trade it for anything, because if it was just became that, who's it ever that easy for? It's so rare.
Right. And I also think it's important for people that are going to go down this journey, speak on something that you're passionate about and also you're willing to educate yourself about. If I had a conversation and I said, well, Fancy, tell me how you make grilled cheese. You could tell me, right? You're going to say whatever your way is. But if I tell you, what do you think the last part was put on the space shuttle? You know, if you looked at a schematic, you don't know. So at least we're talking about things, like I said, lived and learned experience that'll be helpful, especially in our profession. You know, retirement planning is a very big passion of mine. The numbers mean very little to me, not as much as a mental aspect of it, because I see what happens with people that retire. You know, when we think about identity and loss of identity and also health.
There's a part about giving up too soon and going on all this, and Fancy, what you were talking about as well. And Steve, I think you had mentioned this, 7 episodes is about the average of how long a podcast lasts. I actually think the numbers have gone down. I think it's more like 5 now. Who knows, right? And there's different reasons. You know, someone might just come out with a 1-season podcast and it's 7 episodes and that's all they ever wanted. So that's great. So the numbers are skewed. But then you have podcasts that are 1,000 episodes in. So that skews the numbers on the other side. So it's pretty small. But there's a give up. We've talked about Seth Godin and the Purple Cow before. He's got the other book, The Dip. So when do you give up? When do you say, hey, I can't go through it? Or do you push through that wall? Because Fancy, you could have used like, hey, I had a terrible episode. And Steve's like, I don't know if this is working. Fancy sounds, I don't know if she's going to make it as my co-host for this podcast, right? He's not thinking that, but you never know. So when do you know to like, just keep pushing through this thing? Because you have both shown to say, let's keep going. Like, first of all, we have something here. We've gotten great feedback. You're enjoying, even if nothing else, the conversation and the camaraderie that the two of you had. Because I think that almost would be just worth it if no one ever listened to this podcast. what you all are talking about is so impactful on each of you. And just, you can include me in that because it's impactful on me. I think that's worth it. But at what point do you say, let's just like, Fancy, you came to me and like, we got to get to season 2, like immediately. I'm ready to go. Let's keep this train rolling. But there is that point to say people just give up too soon. Maybe it's in the financial career, right? It's very difficult to make those sales early on. And when you don't, like the easiest thing to do is to go look for another job. So what do you think about that?
I think it's two different things. First, yes, people give up too soon on stuff, including building a practice, a financial planning practice. They quit too soon. They don't want to make the phone calls. They don't want to ask their friends and family to do business with them. They think salespeople are bad. They shouldn't have to do this because they had a great career somewhere else, whatever it is, whatever reason that they let their confidence slip and they give up on their career, and they can have a fabulous career in this business, especially women. They're busy, whatever. We quit too soon. So I definitely think that that happens. But I also think that people quit when they're really successful at something. So they get to a certain point and they feel like they've arrived. And I remember, like, we were talking to a bunch of GAs one time, and somebody made this joke, GAs, general agents. Somebody made a joke that said, you know what GA stands for? Gone always. And I laughed at that and I was like, oh my gosh, that's so true, because now they've hit the highest you can be in leadership with this particular company is at that level. And so then they're like, I don't have to do it anymore. I'm done. I can check that box. I can just take the easy street. And so I think that happens on both sides, and you have to fight through both of them, not just the dip, but you have to fight through the peaks too.
I agree. I would tell people you didn't quit too soon. If you believe everything you see or hear from people that are successful, if you believe that people just started off on easy street and worked out fine, you're missing 10 chapters of an 11 chapter book. I say this coaching kids in sports, specifically wrestling and football. I always say one thing, well, two things. Ordinary people do extraordinary things, because we've seen that throughout society. And the other thing I always say is never get upset from the work you didn't do. And kids hate it. Adults hate it, because the truth of the matter is, why would you expect a result if you haven't put the work into it? And it's just, just if you take that saying alone, think about it. Like, I'm going to get on the scale and I didn't put in the work, and I'm just so upset that I didn't lose 5 pounds, Why get upset? Just don't get upset with the work you didn't do. So I would say when you have something like this podcast and you're working on it, understand, visualize one day that you are helping people, or you have the listener that you want. I wouldn't aim it just for business, for sure. I'd aim it more along the lines of, we're in a helping business and people like storytelling. Storytelling is the best way to communicate with people. We learned that from being a little kid. You get your story, you have your milk, your cookies, you brush your teeth, you go to bed. We like to be brought along in a story. Every story that we had, there's a beginning and there's an ending. Hopefully it's a happy ending. And that's what people still are conditioned to listen to. And we're hoping to bring that about in our storytelling.
Yeah. What's coming up for Real Talk, right? You've gotten some episodes that are still going to be released. You have some new conversations that are scheduled. You have season 2 coming around the corner. You have a lot of different things happening with Real Talk. I haven't listened yet, but I've found out about it and I'm intrigued. You got me. Like, what should I be looking for with Real Talk coming up?
When we first started it, we wanted it just to be an internal podcast for our broker dealer. And we, first of all, found out that it's actually easier to do it if you just do it for the general public. So we started running ideas that anyone could listen to and get something out of. So now we've started talking to some advisors from other companies and other broker dealers. And I think that's exciting, just because these topics happen everywhere. It doesn't just happen internally with us. So let's not keep it a secret. So we have some of that where we have some successful people in different businesses, not just in financial planning or just in retirement planning or whatever it is, and just in our broker dealer, but we're talking to some that are outside. And then we're also looking at it from a lot more practice development too. So we're kind of growing in both of those areas.
Definitely. And we expect to have some courageous conversations. Part of our guests will talk to them about challenges, because just like I said earlier, if you believe that everything just folded up nice and neatly and people became successful, that's 1 in trillions that it happens that way. But I would even challenge those people that if you pull back the curtain, you'll find out there's some sort of heartache or something that's gone wrong. That's the only way you learn. So we'd like to have some courageous conversations with our guests to hear some of the challenges, because I feel like as advisors or people in general, if we can align with some of those things, knowing that it's hard sometimes to get out of bed, knowing that it's tough to show up for work, knowing that you get rejection from different clients and things didn't go well and the markets came up and down and interest rates, and being a mom and running kids to practice and events. Our whole goal is to make sure that whatever situation you're going through, we have seen it, we've probably lived through it, and we're hoping to give you some advice that will help you to succeed.
Yeah, and you're giving people a voice to share the stories. I mean, we talked to the individual who's in Minneapolis, who's basically down the street from the George Floyd incident, right? And to hear firsthand, take on what he went through and what his office went through in dealing with those situations. I mean, these are people in your organization and everyone's got their phone put away and they're dialed in for about an hour to have this conversation, this honest conversation with you and being very vulnerable, all of it. Who knows what that could lead to? And I think that's important. We're going to have more conversations around podcasting and creating content. Steve, if you were, and Fancy, I want you to answer this as well, and we'll get more into it in the next episode. But if an advisor is thinking about creating content, starting a podcast, appearing on your podcast, and just starting there, what would your advice be to them as they're maybe thinking about, there's a voice in their head saying, don't do it, right? Because it's scary, right? And we've talked a lot about this, but, taking that direction, you want to go with it. But I'm an advisor, I'm thinking about doing it. What type of advice do you have for these advisors?
My advice would be simply find the need, and then what the need is going to help you develop the topic. If you feel like your clients need to have trusts and wills and things like that, you may want to lightly talk about, without practicing law, talk about estate planning. Whatever that need is that's in your particular situation or what you keep encountering, that's something I would continue to work on because it'll be more natural to you. And one thing I think in any episode or public announcement, if people are not authentic, the public will know. So don't talk about something. I can't give a podcast on how to be a ballerina or, get on the parallel bars at 285 pounds and 6'3". It's just not my strong suit, So stay with something that you're good at and also that you feel there's a need for.
I do think that would get a lot of TikTok views, though, if you did do that. So that might be worth, you never know, right?
Yes, exactly right.
Yeah, and for me, I would just say that it's definitely being passionate around the topic is big key, but also being vulnerable. I think it's so important. And piggybacking on Steve's comment of being authentic, if you cannot be yourself, I love to crack jokes. And I think I'm the funniest person in the world. And I probably am. Let's not kid ourselves. But I really think that if you're in a forum where you can't actually enjoy what you're talking about and let your personality come through and be bold about that, then that's when I would say it's not right for you to do a podcast. If you're trying to do it to please someone else, then it's really not going to. You've got to do it because you want to be yourself and you can be yourself and you can be with someone who has your back in the middle of that process. And I totally have confidence that Steve has my back. If I'm falling flat on my face, he's going to step in and try to help. So,
he did that. I don't even remember. It was a recent episode and you started talking and he just was like, nope. He's like, start over.
Yeah, he did.
It was super right in your face. Like, that's not it. We're hanging up if you can't get it together. And I thought that was great, right? Yeah.
It was. And Eric, you told me to do that too. You're like, hey, just get back in his face. If he says this to you, don't be afraid to get back in his face. And we do that all the time. So,
yeah.
But it's because we have a lot of trust with each other too. So although I think Steve and I could probably, just because of our personalities, we could probably just have never met and throw ourselves into a podcast recording session and still have a good conversation because part of that is just our personalities. We just kind of get along well. But I also think the fact that we have now had 2 years of developing trust in working with the Satera Diversity Council, that we know each other's signals and we can kind of follow through on that. So some of it takes a little time, but having either a partner that you can trust or someone who's going to call you out on something is really helpful.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you one last question, and Steve, we'll start with you. Question is, we've talked a lot about podcasting, the benefits of it, just trying something different, being honest, being vulnerable, all those things. What's something that you just did not expect to happen when you started this podcast that has been a benefit to you, that's come to you from podcasting?
I really feel like I pride myself on being a good listener. The podcast has really helped me with tempo and listening to people thoroughly. So it's really helped me in my own practice. I will say I'm more of a financial therapist than a financial advisor. So I hone in on the listening and the pain points of what people have. But it also has taught me through this podcast how to be a little more patient with people, let them get their point of view out. And as I've always said, I listen to really understand. I don't listen because I'm waiting to talk. And I can tell you, it's helped me in that sense, but it actually has hurt me because I have very little patience when I see constant interrupters. And I'm thinking to myself, you're really not listening to help. You're listening because you want to respond. And that's something this has really helped me in this journey. If you look at how we're speaking in our little quadrants, very rarely do we trip over each other. We just kind of listen, absorb, and if we have something to add is value, great. If we don't, point is well taken, we move on.
Yeah, and a lot of that is from your coaching too, Eric, in this process is you coached us on that to make sure that we have a long enough pause in between. So if you need to get some sounds out or do some editing or whatever, to be cognizant of that. And it took practice for us to get the tempo right. But I think from the surprise to me, it's throwing the focus. And from my time doing improv, which I've done some improv in my past and studied at Second City in Chicago, and I was a theater major in college. We always had to practice that, and you're doing it on stage in front of people, but you're doing it to be funny, to find a way to be funny and to throw the funny to someone else. But in this scenario, throwing the focus has been a big surprise in the fact that throwing the focus, I've learned so much more from other people by throwing the focus. And that's very, very helpful to me in my practice with my clients. And I thought I was doing it until now. And now I know that I can really try to help throw the focus and receive the focus at the right time. And so some of it is skill that I think has been surprising. But also, I think one of the best surprising things to me is how much it affected me in what I've learned from other people and their stories. I didn't expect that because, as somebody who's had things happen to me in my past or whatever, with being a female in a male-dominated industry, you kind of think you've learned it all. You get to this point where you kind of go, there's not anything you can say that would surprise me. And by golly, there is. So that's been the biggest surprise is what I've learned from it, from other people. And I feel like it's made me better as a woman, but more importantly, just as a human being.
Yeah, you just don't know what people are going through. And I've seen that same type of thing, having these conversations. And I've gone into conversations or podcast conversations, interviews, and 2 minutes in, you're like, I did not expect the direction of this conversation to be going this way. And you just don't know. If you talk to people and just listen to them and ask questions, and to your point, Steve, let them talk. It's amazing what you can learn about people. There's a Lex Friedman podcast, and he's got millions of listeners, and he interviewed Elon Musk, right? And he's asking questions to Elon Musk. And he asked the question, and I don't remember exactly what it was, like, how long do you think before someone's living on Mars? Something along those lines. It was just a pause. And I picked up on it. And then apparently a lot of people picked up on it. And it was a 23-second pause where he didn't say a word. And he let him give his answer. Because it's like, you got Elon Musk in the room. You only have him for so much time. Let him answer the question. He processed this. He thought about the answer. And it's just amazing, because you could see that in financial services. If you're asking someone a question and they pause and they're thinking about it, I've seen advisors just almost try to give the answer to them. You don't have the answer. That's their personal thing. So you got to let them talk. So I think, Steve, what you're saying is let that pause, let that be effective. CASDM is our content production company. Why content? It's simple. Content brings people together. I've seen it play out over and over, and I want to help others explore and discover this for themselves. The experience is totally worth it. Learn more at CASDM.com. We focus on podcasts and writing, one piece of content at a time. It all starts with conversations.